继续 Braid 时空幻境的周年重制版。上一期把 Programming 的 Commentary 看完了，啊，还能这么鬼畜了。那这是从这个 Playthrough 开始，啊，乍一看有很多东西，但应该会重复吧？基本上从头打到尾了，应该有不少重复的。Here you can play the game in not in a normal way from the beginning with some commentary. It's not all commentary that exists, as that would be too messy. It's a set hand selected to be nice with linear play. 这个就要看记忆力了，相当于。怎么样？能看吗
？I had an idea of
？1分60秒都看过了吧？
experience silhouetted and almost could act like any logo that other thing and statement beautiful.
1分60秒应该不多。
Well, I don't know, but relatively soon after, once I started thinking about how do I put all this together, like that came in there.
这个看过了。啊，这可能是 visual 的。
I'm looking at the original screenshot of the first screen of Braid that
2分60，这个肯定没看过。
put together. I'm looking for the words because
是一个不一
I
样
can
的声音。
see all the elements that I adapted. I mean, we already have Tim in silhouette in front of a sunset. What may not be clear here is the sky is full of particles. They're just sort of simple, like fuzzy dot particles, but they're kind of scintillating and shimmering a little bit. There was already that idea of the sky moving with particles. And we have the controls giving you the basics of how you're going to begin to interact. I think I always found it a little unnatural that Tim was on a rooftop. I mean, people do sometimes have access to their rooftops in apartment buildings, but it felt a little too much like Spider-Man or something, especially because as you progress to the right, you fall off the rooftop. That kind of broke the immersion for me a little bit, so I reimagined that too, kind of being on a bridge and going down a staircase. Just kind of felt a little better to me. The strongest compositional element here is just that ground plane going across the screen that is supporting the idea that you're going to move to the right. And that's like the first building block of interaction here. The idea of a road ahead, of some unknown challenge and discovery ahead, and a character who we don't know yet, who we're going to invest in and maybe learn about ourselves through this whole thing. Reinterpreting this scene, I wanted to enhance that first impression, take it towards something really a little more bold and iconic. I think I was thinking consciously of iconic. I might say something's iconic because it's well known, but I think that's not the sense I could imagine at the time. Obviously, I was thinking iconic in terms of like a bold, almost like very graphical, simplified. So like the figure there on the bridge, you know, you add the bridge with its particular shapes in front of a background that has a little more of an expressionistic character that just has some resonance to it. I don't know if I can explain it more, but I think turning the roof into a bridge was a good idea. I was imagining that when you finish the game, you would be in some kind of silhouette space with a kind of abstract expressionist background, and that the colors would become familiar yellows and oranges with these floating lights, and then maybe you fall off the end of a ladder into a space with a blue purple background, and you'd find yourself back at the beginning of the game with a purple, like a night sky, like after the sunset.
嘿，啊，是什么呀？哦，这个地方就是刚刚看到的画了，是吧？怎么打开来呢？啊，A 键是能放大缩小的，是吧 ？LB、RB 还能放这么大？哑巴斯给家人。哦，原来如此。这个是刚刚看到一张一张的这个，你可以讲原画了，是吧 ？Braid。
I look at this image and I think the obvious color comparison here is fire. I mean, is there some notion of fire?
To tell you the truth, it was supposed to just be a sunset, and it was kind of late in development. I was getting feedback that it looked like the city was on fire, And I remember I brought that up to John, and he actually wasn't concerned about that ambiguity. He
好
said
像
that's
看过
okay if people think that. And there are, I guess, reasons for that. But I was just thinking sunset. I guess as a product of just the way I would push light and color around, the sunset became this diffuse thing that's like seeping
Yeah,
throughout the
应该
city.
没有，应该没有。
I mean, I think like the way the light works in my painting at the time is not always very scientific, so I just wanted the light throughout the city, and it became this. It looks like a fire, I guess.
It is very striking, though. I mean, do you still feel like, even though it came in the end, you did sort of accomplish this sort of striking imagery that you were going for? It's iconic imagery.
Yeah, I feel really good about this. First, I mean, it was based on John's programmer art version, which had Tim in silhouette on top of a building with what was more recognizably a sunset. But I turned it into a bridge. That's an association I have because of the type of like support structures underneath. I think of a track that's going to take you forward, and a platformer like this is first about moving to the right, moving forward, and that is the first thing you're invited to do as a controller prompt comes up on screen. So I'm thinking of like the basic first element of gameplay that you're about to engage in that defines much of the game. So there is that reference to like a formal characteristic of the platformer genre, which this game does like engage very consciously in conventions of game design of platformers. So that's present, but then the background is this very free kind of explosion of sensation, of like a feeling. I think there's certainly like a wistful or poignant feeling or something like that as you're looking out over a city at sunset.
这个再确认一下。
I had the booting to him. You know, the first thing away.
Yep.
Be an art game. Like this is a like, and but in a way that was fun or whatever.
But you had wanted it.
没事儿，没问题。さあ、ここからやな。基本上每一关都要过一遍，这样才能扫过。它肯定会出现一些，对，像这个东西我之前就看过了，按顺序。
So the house. Well, before that it was, and then they have just process. All
那个应该就是 Doctor 吧
do that.
Right.
So if it's
对对对，
really
看
what
过。
is high attic, probably long before and you get this feeling to think about.
Feeling
Like,
of
back-
progress.
I never put a sign saying you're trying to get into the
Yeah,
attic,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
But it's natural to want to know.
Yes.
And so
这个应
that
该是
all
没看。
seemed like a good way to structure it.
Good way to structure it.
Each room in the house does reflect the themes of the world that you access through the door. So the first one you go to is actually
World 2.
2, and this is the only room that's illuminated when you first enter. It's got a big, comfy sofa, big green sofa. There are going to be green hills in the world. The background is blue with yellow and green highlights. That's like the sky. There's a guitar up on the shelf. You know, there's a stereo. So there are references to kind of, you know, music as animating and lively. There's also a vacuum. I guess that's just like keeping things nice and clean and tidy. maybe the vacuum references like being able to clean up a mess, which is a theme that you can undo your mistakes.
嘿，好多。
How did that idea develop? That
Right? One exercise.
okay.
So heuristics, the idea
这个应该看过。
is not all of it. It's always
Everything else is just not there.
yeah, but even those are better. Cross has and then
嗯。下一个
So the text. So the text.
对，这看过了。
for the expectation.
还好是最近看的，我真的记不住。
So is some right up some. Yeah, it just wouldn't have suffered from me mashing it down. I think.
这个呢？
So we're looking at clouds. So we're looking at cloud screen, in particular the cloud screen for World 2. Now, you actually iterated on this screen quite a bit. So, you know, what's the screen meant to sort of convey or have people feel, and what was your approach to it?
The cloud screen, which we called the world and story screen as well, though it's kind of a mouthful, is a liminal space. For those of you who like liminal spaces, this is a perfect example It's an in-between space between the what we take to be the real world of Tim's house and the imagined worlds or created worlds that you go into. And it's a moment of reforming, reshaping. The clouds are a good metaphor because, as we know, clouds change shape, and a lot of people like to look at clouds and see things. So there's an imaginative, like, projection onto clouds very often, which fits the whole theme of the game of these kind of created worlds that are an extension of Tim. The clouds were present
Wow.
in the version of the game that John showed me when I joined the project. He wanted clouds. We had a kind of fun digression into some alternatives that didn't work ultimately, but it was, I appreciated that he was very open to me trying things out.
So yeah, I mean, you went through some iterations on this screen, and I don't want to go through the pieces of art right now, but it's like I do want to discuss that basic idea of there was a time where you wanted these screens to sort of be a preview of the world you were going into.
Right now, every world has the same screen, except that the story is different. But this was an idea to differentiate them. And I think that's cool. I don't remember why we didn't do it. It might have been, I think maybe one problem was just that if we were to screenshot the level layout and shrink it down, it might just not look terrific, especially for worlds that have very thin floors. Then the question is, what do you put around it? And you have to paint something very fine grain to make it match or generalize it all to a simpler version. It just wasn't a priority. There were some tricky things about it. Plus, probably conflicted with reading the text, so that didn't make it in. I think when we were doing the HD version, I may have proposed that again as though it hadn't happened before, but we didn't do it.
他这个 playthrough 的 commentary 我估计应该就是精选了别的4个部分的讨论，也就我的意思就很可能啊，果然是的，很可能这个没有说只有在 playthrough 能够看到的 commentary，应该都是别的4个部分，所以也就是说，现在这边走下来，要么就是以前已经看到过的，要么就是接下来可能会看到的，就现在看了，那么接下来当你走到什么音乐啊，这个美术啊，就也许不用看了。啊，这个 John 因为是 programmer， 所以他不负责这个美术的部分，讨论美术就换了个人，这个是一开始的。对，所以他是精选了一些他觉得比较有意义的讨论。也就是说，如果你不想看所有的这个 commentary 的话，你可以完全走这个 playthrough，这样他应该把关键东西都给你看掉了。像 我操，有这么多！
You said that. You said.
啊，这回回不去了。这个设计的好过分！等一下，我要去看了，但没那么快。我操！呀，你这个，你说好了不给他搞得很 messy 呢，这个就是很 messy， 这个还不够 messy 吗？这 not only messy but frightening。等一下啊，我要理一下，我的大脑要过一下。
You said.
Yeah, you said 简奈，好愚蠢。1、2、3、4、5、1、2、3。因为我的目标是把所有东西全部都看一遍。这东西非常难判断。看来从那儿走进去更好，是吧？从这个 Jump 派走进去还更好。这两个东西都是一样的。
Where are you chronologically game dev?
啊，这个没看。
Where are you chronologically game dev wise? Like you've passed the test.
I passed the test. I got hired, and we're going forward from the color studies. Actually, the background here is the background from one of the paint over hiring tests. That like pastel-y background with the notable bright pink sort of shape up there. The color palette's derived right out of that. And I remember early on I worked on a lot of grass and rocks. I spent a lot of time just painting large areas of grass, probably excessively. I think I was a little bit hung up on like, how do I do this? How am I painting? How am I working? I can tend to get overly self-conscious sometimes, but at the same time you've got to set a baseline and there's some process there. But I just was drawing many rocks, and there was kind of this repetition of a texture or a rhythm. and trying to bring in the right amount of the material qualities of like this pastel-like brush I was using, all digital work. Here's another one with that same background, a little bit of a hue adjustment, more grass and more of these rocks. Very, I guess like something I notice here is the darkness surrounding it, and it did become a motif that the foreground would kind of fade to darkness further from the playable space, further from the like gameplay surface, partly to kind of suggest a vignette effect and just draw your eye in towards the center of the screen. But something we talked about was trying to create some sense of something lurking, something undermining a little bit the cheerful feeling at the beginning of the game. One pitfall of using background elements this way to extend the foreground into space is you actually weaken the kind of immediate comprehension of the foreground. The squint test is really useful. If you squint, what do you see? And I think playing with the shapes this way does damage your clear perception of where you can stand and where
这
the
个
walls
草
are.
坪已经
Which
跟
we want to feel really immediate. We
游戏
don't
中的
want
差
the
不多
player
了。
have to work too hard to parse out any of that stuff. Now this is just kind of incrementing towards the actual level 2-1, with the actual assets that show up in the game. I'm doing more of that grass and more rocks, but you can recognize shapes that are eventually going to be in the game, including those steps you jump up right at the beginning, including the flowers and some of the particular rocks there in the foreground, and that wall on the far left that changes a bit in the final, but that's the first wall to the left of the door. And my workflow was to develop scenes like this as paintings and then break out individual parts. This is just another progression from the last scene, and I think this is looking very much like the game now.
嗯，
Here's like a complete concept for the feeling and the textures and the colors in World 2. The thing that really stands out to me is the kind of watery, liquidy background, the fragmentation of the leaves up in the tree into these blocky strokes that kind of merge then into the sky, the kind of halos of blue surrounding certain things like the tree just above the door, and the sense of atmosphere that is kind of permeating everything and fragmenting everything into a blue turquoise, and of course the sun, which looks kind of like when you're making over easy eggs and they break by accident. These are just some designs for specific elements within World 2. We've got the trellises, which are climbable surfaces, and there are a couple kind of fanciful ideas, and then a more conventional one which is close to what was used in the game. I was trying something fanciful with these trees that are built like ladders somehow, or with the branches sort of, there's a kind of weird middle ground between something organic and something like highly artificial here. And I like this, and I thought it would look cool with the leaves blowing around gently. But I guess it was sensible to go with a more conventional trellis that's like an identifiable thing. It has very clear edges as well, unlike one of the tree concepts, so you know where you can climb and where you can't. Gameplay clarity is really important. And we have some very hot-looking succulents. Throughout the game there are spike hazards, and this is just kind of a drawing I liked of a thing that we did not use. Here's a tree that has a bunch of weird branches and shapes. It is in the game without some of those extensions, so you'll recognize that. But all these little, I guess the idea was it could be repurposed with all these add-ons, but I didn't do that. What this shows is the old art that preceded me mingled with the new art I was doing. Just kind of weird, because John had like hired somebody to do a bunch of art, and you can see the style here, this kind of storybook illustration style, these gnarled trees and mushrooms and everything, all kind of out of scale to Tim. Like look at the size of those mushrooms that Tim would step on off of that ladder. It's also funny to me that, it's clearly underground. There are stalactites hanging. The bounds of this space are kind of suspended within the larger background. So like, in other words, the walls don't go off infinitely. You're kind of held within this strangely shaped chamber made up of this tree. Anyway, it's got an interesting character of its own, but my new stuff is sitting with it, and very discordantly, but I guess the game looked like this at one point.
这些都是可以看的，是吧？来了啊！ 誰もやりたくないのパートが始まった了。还有 not all， 我全部都要给你复一遍的。啊，不是吧？哦，这都已经6了。
We've discussed the individuation of walk around.
啊，行了，想起来就好了。
It is very easy when talking about art with a capital A.
Capital A 啊，
That I heard this is really what, and there kind of ain't that many people on that team, is what I feel like.
right。上来就能让这看过了，上来就能让人这么 terrific。
On these,
That's common.
Weird game just to have decided not to do this, which otherwise did not come up until much later in the final game.
相当早年的东西了。这里还有个音乐了。
Hunt in this world.
看过，
And now,
这个应该没看过。
A bit about time traveling in sound, because as mentioned earlier, the original Braid did not have any ambient sounds except in the 3 rain levels in World 3. But since we decided to add that extra dimension to all the levels in the remastered Braid, we started to face challenges here in World 4. Because in this world, when you move from left to right, you move in time, and thereby you also move back and forth in sound, since sound only exists in time. It means that at any given point on the horizontal axis of the game level, you will hear the exact same part of the ambience and the music, which means that we can be very precise about what you hear where in the level. In this specific level, where the camera is locked, it only takes about 6 seconds to walk from left to right in the screen, and that means it is only a 6-second long ambience you move back and forth in. So here we designed a single 6-second audio file that consists of a left-panned winter wind in the beginning and gradually became a right-panned warm water babble at the end, and thereby matched the environment that Tim is walking through at any given moment. So he's actually walking back and forth in the sound file. And in many ways this gave us a whole new perspective on sound design. It's like actually moving back and forth in a snapshot of time. And what then when Tim, and thereby time, doesn't move, and theoretically no sound can exist? Again, sound only exists in time. Here we tried to make our interpretation of a snapshot sound, or what we call a frozen sound of the ambience in the given level. A small curiosity is that when Tim walks up or down the little hill in the lower right of the screen, you hear a small glitch in the music. This is actually not a bug but a feature, resulting from Tim slowing time a bit down while he also climbs the vertical axis. The same effect as if someone slowed down the turning record for a short moment. We actually wanted to fix this little music glitch that the level design presented, but since the glitch was also there in the original Braid, the new and old music tracks would come a tiny bit out of sync, which was against our principle of sample accuracy between the 2 versions. So we decided to keep it.
这个已经是 music 了。啊，别子你进来，反正早晚要看。哎。
I like how the background now is like a single painting. That's something I got to do a few places. Usually we're trying to build things out of smaller multi-purpose parts, but here that whole background cliff is like a single painting. So I guess in the SD version, those pieces are actually foreground pieces that are just tinted towards the background, which means they have the wrong detail density. Background stuff is supposed to be rougher with bigger brush strokes. So we were able to correct that. Here's a place where we changed the camera zoom. Basically, the walls and floor are very thin, and it's not the best compositionally. It kind of feels nicer to have a little more of a border. You feel more like supported and enclosed, and it's just benefits the scene. But also, a lot of TVs by default crop the image in, which is one of the most insane things that we just have to struggle with in our modern world. So yeah, a lot of people will probably play this and like not even see much of the walls or floor, which is crazy. So those are combined reasons for changing the zoom level. Also, please appreciate how every monster icon up in the top HUD is uniquely drawn, as are the X's that cover them as you murder them.
Really? Wow. You're crazy.
John told me to do that.
So one of the things about the game, we've
啊，
already
这个可能
said,
看过了。
wanted to feel conditional
啊
all
啊，
of
这
the
他说的
X's
顶上了，
being
对对对对。
that I was doing and wanted to
I
do,
see.
right?
他是老大呀。
The idea for this
啊，这行了。
other time timings and all the way close that you can so much. He just didn't. You've
只要是
still
这个
made
John 一个
what
一
the
个人
video
不停的
guide
讲的，
you
基本都听过
sometimes。really can't make a spectrum
剩
between
下
the
的
two
音乐也好，美
possibilities.
术也好，都是
I do think sometimes players jump repeatedly to try and cross it because it is not so wide as to dispel all doubt immediately. So maybe it should have been
a little bit wider
a。little bit wider.
这怎么说来着？
So the first world is like, okay, here's
啊，
how
是
to
那个
run.
Doctor 是吧？
Here's how. So the first world comes to you, and this
Right, and so and of course the monsters on the screen, and so this puzzle is harder.
对，想起来了，嗨。这个地方设计的，你敢告诉我是不 messy 吗？这三个东西，你看看这 back 都顶在后面了。It's very terrible design。
We've now stated two constraints. We've said puzzles are about
Constraint.
and you jump.
Right.
Okay, the puzzles. One's
对，
See,
这看过
Donkey
了，
wants
高度
so
嘛。
a priori, you then seemed true. It's gonna the play test result is not that true. Like if you're a good designer, you actually should
看过
kind
看
of
过
know what's gonna happen.
Right。
Decided early on somewhere they got to I knew makes them hard getting out that it's
这个
like
是
I
game
think
design，
in the
拼图 design。
so I'm happy
Right,
because I'm not the screen and see all the difficulty, right?
right.
So that leads to
compact designs。
compact designs that are simpler in terms of number of walls and number of rooms and
Right.
whatever.
Right.
下一个
You said that in this game,
Mario Jump。
the jump.
啊，
Jump, like,
这已经不知道第几次了。
hard to have in run it.
你看过了，如果绝对很清楚，你绝对是看过了，也不需要再反复验证的就好很多。好的，这个你想就是那个 hunt， 接下来马上就能走到 hunt 了，继续往前。
This is a great place to look at the living painting idea, which is an extension of stuff we were doing in the
这个
old
playthrough
version,
看来也不短。
which has large paint strokes kind of free floating. There's an idea of fragmentation, of the world breaking down into its component parts, showing the hand of the artist, showing the artifice, the created nature of it, the fluidity of it, the malleability of it. And so in the new version, we extended that with these live brushstrokes, which were one of the most laborious things to put in. I manually placed them. I mean, first of all, I created a whole series of brushstrokes that would match different areas in the painting. So the different types of trees and shapes that you see back there, like they're the pointy evergreen style trees, and they're the little round trees back on the hill, and there are brushstrokes in the grass, and there are those like bright contour highlights along the hill. All of those got brushstrokes, which I made to be as multi-purpose as possible, but in some cases they're like specifically for a certain area. I guess the hope is that you'll at some point put the controller down or just stop moving and just look at the screen and enjoy a kind of lava lamp effect, that it's soothing and enveloping. Maybe at a moment when you're stumped and not sure what to do and you're thinking, that would be the moment where you really appreciate these details. I feel like you can run through and maybe not catch some of them, but I did spend a lot of time on it, so hopefully that's worthwhile.
For me, I may have never noticed these if you didn't point them out. Like
Same here.
I might have noticed that, you know, there was some, I don't know, wiggling going on, you know, like, but, you know, you did spend a lot of time on it. And, you know, I guess, do you mind that something you worked really hard on isn't
good
necessarily
question.
noticed and might be entirely in the subconscious, if anywhere?
A little bit, because that wasn't the intention, that it wouldn't be very noticeable. It's always a matter of figuring out how subtle to be, and that was definitely a theme on Braid both times. I want you to notice these things, but I don't want you to be distracted by them.
Oh,
It was a process of like tuning the speed of these effects to kind of find out how like loud they should be, so to speak. If you rewind and like you know, you can rewind faster, like if you hit I don't know what it is on different controllers, but rewind and then hit the bumper, left bumper a couple times or something. Well, there's a screen distortion effect that hides some of this, but you'll see it'll be more noticeable. You'll see the paint strokes drawing, and maybe that'll help you out. But it varies scene to scene, but it should be something you can notice if you really like Maybe you need to get a really big TV, or sit really close, put your face right up to it.
Get a better TV.
Get
so
a
you
better
can see
TV.
my art.
Okay, what kind like no and it's fun all that there's one adapt
Right.
一听到你的声音出来，我就知道我已经看过了。
retro games in Braid as well of
Right, which
other
we'll have to talk
genres
about since that did not actually
that
happen.
did not actually happen.
We should talk about those.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
这个是音乐，这肯定没看过。
We didn't compose
哦，
new
这好像看过。
songs for the new edition because I don't think it's necessary.
啊，
I
这个
don't
是
know.
看过
I。did that blind. I got game. Get that. That's my original sound.
这期都
set.
不一定能把
I mean,
Word
it's
2 搞
certain
定，
variation.
没准一个 Word 一期，但这个对后面是有帮助的，所以还是有意义。
They had more license to bring more creativity to it and revamp the sound effects, and
And
they're
plus you
all
had-
high
and
quality.
Plus, you
now.
had an audio team.
Yeah, and that
You didn't
matters.
Have that before.
The design of the basic monster character was definitely influenced by John's original programmer
这
art
完全不像，好
character,
吧？
which is a kind of flat affect or kind of moody looking yellow lumpy thing. And then Edmund McMillan worked on all the character art before me. Although in a lot of cases I redesigned the characters' faces and features, the animation cycle here is the same. So like the shape of the feet and how they're moving is Edmund's work. And when Edmund's version was like a brown hairy guy who looked kind of gloomy also. So it was always like a lumpy or hairy little round guy who looked moody. You know, he's basically a Goomba character. Are Goombas kind of moody to begin with? They're kind of grumpy and moody.
I mean, they
Mario.
have no mouth, right? Like it's just
They have a mouth.
eyes.
Oh, in the Sprite, you're right.
In the Sprite, yeah, the original. I mean, sure, now they do, but they tend to have. It's not furrowed. They have like diagonal brows, whatever you would
Yeah.
call that. So there's sort of a like grumpiness to them, I'd say.
They're grumpy, yeah. So I think that's in keeping with like the inspiration, but they've got more of a human face, maybe more of a Tim face. I don't know. Like I guess the texture of the hair or whatever is just sort of a shape I came up with. It's kind of feathery, so they're kind of feathery shapes. I think it was just like a furry, feathery thing that appealed to me.
This sound effect of monsters is one of the first sounds we started out to redo, since we felt the original sounds had some built-in problems. First of all, there were only 2 variations of this sound in the original game. It was this one and this one. So, especially in the later levels where the monsters are dying constantly, these 2 sound effects become very tedious.
对的，
Second problem was that they actually didn't connect very well to the visuals, in our opinion. They sounded more like human voice than strange troll head things. And also they didn't connect very well to each other in the way that the 2 sounds sounded so different that you actually try to find a meaning in which sound means what, although they play totally random. So we wanted to remake the sound entirely to be able to have both more variation but also more similarity between them, although that sounds a bit like a paradox. And then we wanted to make them connect more with the visuals, which meant more non-human, but still sound like the original Braid, which meant quite human. So, yeah. Furthermore, we had a note from John saying that they should sound like, and I quote, fun with an undertone that it's sad that you're killing something that just wanted to be there, so maybe it's a little more cute with an undertone of not being cute. End quote. So, as one can imagine, this wasn't very straightforward, and we tried a billion different approaches before ending up with the sound you hear. As it often is with sound design, it ended up being my own voice, barking my throat sore, which sounded like this. Yeah, these are the actual raw recordings, but they were then manipulated further afterwards. And to make it feel more physical and make it connect better visually, we also added a lot of body punch and chest sounds like this. So the original 2 very different variations of just voice playing in the game are now 14 variations of both voice and body.
诶，
Another thing to note is this sound of monsters getting killed always played together with the player bouncing sound.
对的，
This was a sound that was originally very cartoonish, as you can hear, and John wanted to move away from that. But still, to keep that original feel of the game and not change it too much, we remade the same sound with a large wooden ruler, but made it sound much softer and again with many more variations to it.
这个姜还是会有点折腾的啊，这 sound design team 也不容易啊。
As I said in the commentary about this monster kill sound, we went through a lot of iterations, and in the end it was signed off and everybody was happy, and the previous commentary about this sound was even recorded. And then, towards the very deadline, John had second thoughts about the sound and thought we had lost some of the original Braid idea, and I think he was right. But instead of talking about how we made yet another iteration on this sound, I'd rather talk a bit about what it is about this specific sound effect that is so hard to nail. First, we need to think, why do we even need the monsters to have a sound? Actually, we were at some point considering more sounds for them, like small clop 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 footsteps when they walk, or a small mumble when they turn to make them more alive. But these considerations died quickly because that would be an extremely annoying noise in levels where they just walk mechanically back and forth. And also, exactly because they do behave so mechanical, we can't really make them come alive in any believable way. They are not NPCs that we pretend have any intelligence or free will. They are almost like robots or primitive bugs. So they should definitely not have any idle or walk sounds at all. But still, there is and should be a sound when they are killed. That sound is needed for several reasons. First, we want the player to know that the kill was executed successfully and that they gained the jump height from it. That confirming part could easily be achieved by any sound, a beep or a bell or whatever UI sound. And we actually also have the ruler sound to take care of that part. But we also want the player to know that there was a cost. You did actually kill something that wasn't just a robot. So it is a step more than just a UI sound, that you need to feel some kind of flesh and blood and mind. In the original game, John found this sound for that purpose. And it definitely does the job of confirming the kill and also making you feel a tiny bit bad about it if you have any heart at all. So John's original sound actually works and serves these two practical purposes as well.
OK，
So when doing the remaster, we could have gone with that idea by just making this sound better and make some more variations of it. But as mentioned, we didn't feel this sound glued to the visuals. It felt like a sound coming from the game and not from the monsters themselves. So we would have to find the glue that glues the sound to the monster you just killed. And that's where you start thinking of what they actually are. They are a two-dimensional head with feet living inside a painting, born out of a cannon and living a sad mechanical life. They are lethal but easily killed. And what do a creature like that sound like? And of course, this question is so open and abstract and can be interpreted in so many ways. So no matter what Martin and I came up with, we either disagreed internally or John thought it just didn't sound right. I started to have that feeling that we would never find the right voice for this because every person hears this differently. And you can imagine what I felt when John wanted to tweak this sound again right before the game launched. I found some examples here from that early, painful but fun process.
好多。
Seen in retrospect, we were pretty settled on the body part of the sound, as you can hear, but we tried and tried to find the voice of the monsters. And by doing that, I think we just moved more and more away from the original idea, which didn't become obvious until much later. But actually, in this case, I see now that we had the answer right in front of us. We didn't need to invent the wheel again because this is a remaster, and John already defined the voice decades ago. It seems so obvious now that we just had to add that glue that we felt was missing, and I think these body and chest sounds we developed quite early on actually does the trick. The new sounds are as simple as a bunch of extra variations of the human which I then performed myself, and then various chest punches, and also nose sounds like this one. And this is actually added for more technical reasons, to fill a bit in the upper part of the frequency spectrum. And that's something I'd always do on these important communicating sounds, make sure that they are full frequency so they stand out of the mix of the music in any kind of listening environment. So this is where these sounds ended for now at least. Let's see if there's another iteration in a week or so.
哇，这个音乐部分看来也不短啊。
There's something about the sound effects when you pick up
啊，
there's
这个看
some
过，
grades or more
就那个几个声音嘛。
effect. Watching people play test this game, so I don't
走
take
吧，
these difficulty ratings
总算把一
too
关过了了。
seriously.
It's not easy 啊，这个的 Cloud Bridge， 这还有音乐。
The challenge with downstream was that the later part of the track is very intense and potentially innovating over repeated listening, especially if you're struggling to solve a puzzle.
这口音就很重。
A crucial factor in this regard is the rather piercing quality of the solo violin, so a lot of work went into softening the higher frequencies. Apart from regular EQing, the plugin Soothe was used heavily to reduce frequency spikes above 4 kHz. As a result, the piece feels less aggressive, and to soften the track even further and make it sit better in the environment, a mountain-like echo was added to the overall mix. Unfortunately, we didn't have stems for downstream, which posed some challenges for the remastered version later in the game.
Did you contribute in a game design sense at all, or were you strictly limited to visuals?
I did get to contribute to design a little bit, and I was happy about that. I remain proud of it because I'd only recently started working with John, and it was all remote over email. So I didn't know this guy, but I was excited that we were doing this thing together, and it was a great job for me to have at the time. And John was trying to figure out how to visually justify, how to make it intuitive that there are moving cloud platforms that disappear and then reappear somewhere else, kind of looping. They're just moving platforms that have to loop. And he actually emailed me and some of his designer friends, and there were a bunch of ideas. And I had the best idea,
嘿，
which was to use something that already existed, which were the cannons. There were already two kinds of cannons that shoot fireballs, which is what you would expect, and cannons that shoot monsters. So there was already an idea that cannons can shoot non-obvious things. And so the cloud was just another extension of that, a cloud cannon. And that way you have the cloud itself is the visual starting point of the cloud. And when the cloud hits an object, hits a wall, it will disperse, and then the cannon will fire again. So yeah, it was just like kind of an elegant solution.
As a former producer, I very much appreciate the recycling of concepts.
Yeah. What is parallax? Parallax primer. Parallax is, I hope I get this technically right, but it's basically the effect as you move laterally and you're looking out sort of perpendicular to your direction of movement into the distance, and you see things closer to you moving more quickly than things far away from you. If you're in a car going down the road and you look out the window, distant mountains or buildings or clouds or the sun will appear to move hardly at all while the nearby roadside or whatever is flying by. So it's one way that we perceive depth. And of course, this is a 2D game. So the camera moving side to side is a great opportunity to create depth with parallax. And so we've added a lot more layers here. Yeah, it definitely increased the complexity and challenge of composing the scenes. You need to keep an eye on how visibility develops when the camera moves. Things get occluded by what's in front of them as the camera moves. And you want to make sure that the composition works as it evolves. And you don't want to put stuff back there that is never visible because it's always occluded. And so that's kind of an experimentation process, as well as a conscious design process. It got pretty tricky at times to compose these scenes because Braid wasn't really built to make any of this easy. Every object you see here has both a depth value and a parallax value, and they're not linked. And these are arbitrary values that I was assigning while I was playing. So, you know, something near to you might have a value of 10 or 50, and then like the hill in the background might be 500 or something. And these are numbers that I picked, again, arbitrarily. They varied from area to area. And I kind of would develop like a routine or a kind of a tendency, but then that might evolve. But I tried to leave enough space that I could put other stuff in between as well. Then the parallax value is separate, so it's on me to keep those things straight, because the problem is you can have conflicts between the depth value and the parallax value. So something that's visually behind other stuff moving faster than it, now you have a conflict, and it's kind of brain breaking and looks horrible. So you absolutely can't have that. But I had to like manually track all that stuff. And when there are not too many parallax layers, it's not too hard to like throw stuff in and then find the right gaps in between for new objects. But then when I came back to add a lot more objects and it gets denser, it's very easy to find conflicts. And then all you can do is like subdivide your values more into like decimal points, or try to shift things back to create more space. So it's kind of silly.
When I'm hearing that there's a depth value and a parallax value, right? To my mind, that's just universal math. You know what I mean? That like, just keep a spreadsheet of like, know that if something's at this distance, it's this value, right? But you're saying you just kind of like observe.
I'm an artist, Frank. I shoot from the hip.
So you just kind of observed and like manually tweaked and kept observing, and like that was your process. And I'm almost wondering if
对，这个就是科学家跟艺术家的对话。
approach, if by taking more of an artist approach, you might be creating interesting effects that wouldn't happen if you did things literally.
Maybe so. I don't know if it led to interesting stuff or not. I mean, I definitely did, in one instance, make a spreadsheet because there were enough values and things to keep track of. So I did make a spreadsheet for the depth value and the parallax values at one point. But I don't know. I think I just, again, it was simple enough in the early stages that the tools kind of encouraged me to like throw something in, and then like it would be at a default value, and I would like throw it back 30. And then that would be fine for all the stuff of a certain kind, like all the trees back there.
Right.
And then, this one's in front, then I'd hit like Shift W or whatever and bring it forward. And it just kind of was simple enough to work that way.
Got it.
But it did get to a point that I dug myself into enough of a hole, I had to make a spreadsheet.
我操你！哎呦完了，我这全身都起鸡皮疙瘩了。你这里还跟我搞 cross reference， 那我能打到哪儿啊？哎呦我操，这倒是有点绝望了。Cloud cannons， 好。哦，就这么一片是吗 ？Cloud cannons。
It's worth going into the situation with the clouds a bit more. Early on, I had wanted some kind of platform that you could ride on, and some other games had clouds, so I did clouds too.
这个应该是
But they were
John，
implemented in a very simple
但我没
way,
听过，
where they would move from left to right through a marked out region
好像
of
没听过。
space, and when they got to the end, they would disappear and reappear back on the left. This provided good baseline functionality, but I felt this was a very programmery behavior for clouds. Programmers understand things wrapping through an interval, but for normal people it seemed weird. And understanding this behavior was important when puzzles got hard, and when you began slowing down the clouds and so forth. With the old behavior, if you used the ring to put two clouds closer together, they would stay closer together afterward as they kept wrapping through the interval, as opposed to now when they eventually disintegrate and are replaced by fresh clouds that are evenly spaced. Also, when the clouds wrapped back to the start of the interval, they disappeared abruptly, which looked and felt unpleasant. When David suggested making a cannon that fires clouds, and turning the clouds into temporary objects just like cannonballs, it seemed like a pretty good idea to me, but I wasn't sure if we should do it, since we already had some levels that used the older style of clouds, and I might break those levels by changing the cloud behavior. In particular, there was one level early in the game that was full of lots and lots of clouds moving at different speeds to make a big mess, because I thought the mess was funny and interesting, and I wasn't sure how that would go if there were cannons firing the clouds. Thankfully, though, I decided just to change the behavior to David's idea, break the game, and fix the levels that needed fixing. The area with a mess of many clouds, I just simplified down to something cleaner, because the mess of clouds was not a very deep idea overall. This eventually became the beginning of the level called the Cloud Bridge, which now has merely one cloud cannon on the left-hand side.
居然还有这样的追加桥段 Cloud Cannons 啊，这样子东西就解锁了是吧？哇、wow, ，Depth Value Hassle， 哇，我的天呐，然后这东西就出来了啊，至少没出来。
All this hassle David is talking about, involving the adjustment of depth values to sync with parallax values, is actually totally unnecessary. If I had known how much trouble it was going to be, I would have fixed all this early on, saving us a bunch of work. But I don't feel too bad about it, because this kind of thing seems to happen in every game, in ways different from the last, and whenever a new difficulty arises, it's extremely unclear at the time. If this is one of those situations where we should buckle down and implement a stronger solution, or maybe it isn't that bad and we can just make faster and easier progress by persevering through the difficulties. Often, I still don't know how to tell the difference. I can just hope to keep getting better at determining the right choice to make at these times. Original Braid didn't have any parallax layers. Everything always scrolled at the same rate, just like an older 2D game. But the game needed to know which objects are in front of which other objects, which is what the depth values are for. Something with a depth value of 100 is behind something with a depth value of 50 and must be drawn first, so the closer thing can be drawn on top. It wasn't clear, till we'd been working on art for a bit, that we wanted variable parallax, at which point I needed to provide a way for that to happen. I added parallax values, which are a straightforward way of describing to the game how fast things scroll. A parallax value of 0.5 means that this object scrolls half as fast as the foreground. In a 3D game, depth and parallax are the same thing, and the game uses a perspective transformation matrix to make this happen. But in 2D, it seemed like we might want more freedom, and besides, if two things parallax at the same rate, we still need to say if one thing is in front of the other or not, which suggests a separate depth value. And anyway, we already had some art in the game that already had depth values, and it seemed like a waste to rack all that data in order to define depth based on parallax values. Big mistake. If you ever see yourself thinking this way when making a game, stop, especially if it's early. Change how things work, take the hit, clean up the mess, and move forward. It will be much, much better in the long run. For stuff parallaxing at the same rate, we could just make the parallax value of one thing infinitesimally less than the other thing, or we could just add a secondary sorting key. And no reason ever came up to have depth and parallax settings be inconsistent with each other. But because we left in the ability for them to be inconsistent with each other, David had to constantly guard against this and do a bunch of extra planning that apparently involved spreadsheets. Sorry, David. My bad.
这个东西相当的技术性啊，讨论这个 depth 跟 parallax。不能完全算 programming， 有点像是应该就是画 design art design visual design 是跟这个相关联，完全听不懂。即便他已经稍微解释了一下，我还听不懂。这个需要去，如果想听懂，可能需要去搜一下了，这到底什么东西？接触过一些这个设计、视觉设计，应该会懂。不光是游戏嘛，别的一些设计可能也需要画。
Whereas if they're a little bit different, if they're doing things that are a little bit absurd. So one of the most famous
啊，对 ，OK, I get you, got you. 这两个应该看过的。
Is there more to say about why there is a
difference?
I don't feel that the explanation I gave Mark about why there are puzzle pieces in the game was then disappears.
Mark 10 Bosch.
Communicates random information. Gameplay to the story is important to instantiate that number physically in the game.
这看过的。
Even though the ladders are not as rich or interesting as the puzzle pieces.
这个肯定是没看过。
They really can't be because there are so few. This thing that we're talking about, the World 2 thing, is all the following thing.
Biggest mistake.
As you together and have a lead up through thing can maybe get it going
Dip
a
a
little
toe
bit.
in.
这个呢？
So far, a lot of the upgrades have been these sort of incremental things. Just kind of bringing the game up to par at 4K. But I'm very glad we found areas to really add like notable features. John had guided us away from a Star Wars special edition approach, which is to say just putting things in to have more things. We really didn't want to disrupt decisions that were good decisions that we'd made before.
Okay.
But thankfully, this was an area that looks kind of barren in the original version, certainly relative to its importance, which is that it's got one of these puzzle frames, and that's kind of a big deal. There's a puzzle frame in every world, so in each case, this was an opportunity to add some scenery. And here, it's just to make it more unique. Rather than having more reused flowers and things you've seen before, it's a more cultivated feeling, like a garden, like people have put care into it, which totally fits the theme of the world. A sense of optimism and upkeep and tending to the garden.
And did you feel the freedom to upgrade this because it was so barren?
Yeah. There are cases where I tried more aggressive redesigns. Mostly those are not in the game. And it always just felt like, I guess there's just some awareness of the audience. Like, we don't want people to be disappointed or feel like now you've made an alternate version that now I don't know which one I like more kind of thing. Like, we wanted to make a new version that would be easily accepted as like better for the most part. And you can always play the old one. But we didn't want to make one that just felt like a diverged so much it was now like going to create a lot of controversy over which one was more kind of correct. I don't think I felt like too much kind of respect or kind of like deference to my old decisions, but once I got in the weeds and tried to do something different, it just felt senseless. Like, it felt like things I'd done before had been done organically in a certain context, in a certain like train of thought. And it felt kind of hopeless and ridiculous to like radically reinvent stuff. Like, I did a couple mock-ups of like completely changing how like the underground boss area in World 3 looks, and it's just kind of silly and pointless.
Right. 总算可以到下一关了。这个肯定 hunt， 对对对，这刚刚已经看过了，1、2、3、4、5，对，这完全一样。Nice。Bye bye and fuck you。离谱啊，这个应该看过。
The first little part, the first I
加那个 doctor 声音。
I'm smart.
OK， 音乐应该没听过。
In contrast to downstream, Lullaby set sounded somewhat dull with a
Lullaby
slight
set.
depressing mid-range. This was solved by way of EQ, valve distortion, and adding a bit of hardware spring reverb to add brilliance. For consistency, the same mountain-like echo used in downstream was added to the overall mix. We didn't have stems for this track, which wasn't a big issue since it's only playing in World 2, where we wanted to stay close to the original.
Downstream 应该是 OST 的这个每一首曲子的曲名嘛。
then in the number of layers this mind using
Just the doctor.
How time is there, but then it's not that big of a problem. You know, if an all play this,
many multiple tries and rewind, time can branch in various ways, and this is kind of the part of the game where we first start to get that.
Rewind was work and playing.
Interested in how did you get over this?
Discussed now. Can be
这个应该是 Muratory。
and get about how to where
Right.
the place
Right.
like it's like okay.
OK，
You-
就没了。
As we would.
Can you, and you it's good because you're forcing them to do something that they don't know is a good move. And if there's any other pits that go off screen anywhere else in the game, you're now still again creating an unfair and uncertain situation. And
Right.
so, well, that's not true if you have rewind.
Right.
Like free rewind, and that was one of the
啊 ，Free Rewind，
PCs in the beginning. Like I said in the Moriarty talk,
对，想
it
起来，
was
想起
like
来。
it should be totally free, and you were like it should just be a feat.
Right。哦，这底下是吧？我操，这怎么会有？根本回不去，好像。啊，回来了。哇，这东西的判定神类啊！我操，看一下啊。哇，这能设计出来。
let's talk about these two pieces of level one at a time. This first one came later, and then leap of faith. If you die, because that's like that matter line before you, right? Sure.
Game that's demanding. Like, if only I could do. Oh wait, I can.
对，说过了啊，这里居然就一个。
But I like this part. I like jumping down the big pit. But I like this part. I like jumping down the big pit. And it's a good place to appreciate some of the new animation transitions and footstep particles. As you're falling, Tim turning side to side now has like a smooth transition rather than popping between positions. And when he lands, he does some kind of, like he lands,
Wow.
he kind of catches himself with bent legs. When you land from that kind of incredible height, you should always bend your knees. You don't want to land stock upright because you will like decimate your knees and your ankles. So if you fall 7 to 12 stories, bend your legs on impact.
But below 7.
Then you want to be firmly upright because it just looks cool. Looks confident.
I had a friend shatter both of his ankles not bending his knees from a 1-story drop. So 6 months.
Don't jump out of windows. But yeah, there's a big plume of dust when Tim lands here, and there's also smaller plumes of dust in other cases, so please appreciate those. That's all new stuff. I mean, it just looked kind of weird before when he landed and didn't have any kind of acknowledgement of the fall.
OK， 这就是个画是吗
But I like this part. I like legs.
？Right。这怎么查？
If you were hanging around in the early
Ah,
classes,
it's
yet,
come.
from back or test never struggled with tweaking.
是在 Jump Height 的话，早就已经又是这地狱般的地方，这地方谁愿意来啊？这里还有个 back， 我操！杀了我吧！操 ！Alternative design，No，OK， 回来了。这个东西做的太丧心病狂了，我操！这看
So
过了。
on 2, 3, after you go down the pit, you go. So on 2, 3, after you go down the pit, you go straight back up the other side,
Yes.
and there's like guys falling down, and there's compartments on the side, and the illustrator could do in a
Yoshi's
normal-
Island.
Right.
which is why it's unfair, right?
Right.
Because you lose lives or whatever.
Right.
And here it's like that doesn't happen, right?
Because of her rewind.
That was one of the theses. That was one of the. It's like as I see it, not going to do.
As your
You ruin the game around rewind.
right, just like make consequence not the important part or whatever.
这个是 Miratory， 这个是 Miratory。OK， 最后一个了，干嘛嘞？
This part also got a lot of attention, and
还有
they repainted a lot of this stuff, kind of custom all as one piece, which again is unusual. But
丧心病狂。
in the original art, that central column dividing the two halves of the pit is kind of haphazardly constructed for a lot of things I already had. And there are even a couple cases where you can see the seams because they really don't fit too well.
Oh,
It's really
okay.
kind of stretching the premise of this collage approach. In the new version, I've painted it all as one piece and also painted unique backdrop rather than reusing foreground assets for the backdrop, and corrected or changed the lighting so the cave is actually dark in the
这个
background.
是
So we have
David.
more consistent use of value, which I think is more legible and creates a better sense of an interior space versus the outside.
Well, in general, I'm seeing a lot more contrast in this remaster.
Yeah, I mean, legibility is really important, and we worked on that in Braid, but I think I have a better grasp now of value and brightness and darkness as like a way to create clarity and everything. So yeah, we've added either dark or light shadows or like particles behind the foreground along its edge so that it just stands out better.
哦 ，The stuffed dinosaur 已经躲在里面了。
Similarly to framing the puzzles, you're also framing the castles.
Framing the
That's
castle.
sort of a new thing here, right?
Right. There's often kind of an empty space before the castles. And yeah, I did like wonder, is that empty space something to preserve? I mean, it's nothing to say empty space is bad. I think it kind of creates some anticipation, like you've just gotten through something and now there's kind of a break. But since it's a remake and we're looking for places to do new things, it actually seemed like a pretty good candidate for some new scenery. And so in each world, there's new stuff as you approach the castle. And I think it turned out pretty well. I think it was like not a bad decision. So here it's extending that idea of a very pretty, cultivated place, safe and harmonious, and kind of just taking the castle atmosphere and extending it outward a bit more. I like the shadow here when you go under that overhang, that Tim falls into shadow. So that's something we did wherever we could.
So what are these castles to you? What do they sort of represent to Tim in your mind?
Well, let me just get out of the way that the castles are also a familiar game trope that we all know. So we are kind of referencing the history of games and consciously using the format of a side scroller to do something with a little bit different vibe, more personal and introspective. But what they actually serve in the story, I think, is kind of representing Tim's aspiration, idealism, castle being something really far removed from his like modern urban dwelling, but again is kind of a fantasy castle. It's not like referencing here like necessarily feudalism or like other things you might associate with like the construction of castles, but it's like something beautiful to aspire to, that his search would bring him to something transcendent.
请说。But the princess is in another castle。这样这个算是 World 2算搞定了，也听这个 artist 说话确实比听 John 说话还要累。John 呢虽然有点绕，但毕竟还是一个这个 programmer， 说的话有些时候虽然绕，但没有太多的这种修饰词，说白了就是词汇量还挺普通的，至少能让观众听得懂啊。这个 artist 我感觉这期我有相当多的词汇，我要去查一下，真的不太行啊。就把这个看掉，就如果说看过就看过了，没看过。
So I didn't want it to be like a story-based game in the way lots of games are, where
这看过，
you go,
这看过，
where the
illustration
as an introduction. People do think characters, and it was one of.
Yes.
对。
I wanted it to be an art game, but
有影响。
unapologetically an art game, right? Because I'd been thinking about art games and experimental games and all this stuff, and I was seeing that certain classes of things were not being made.
是，这个虽然看掉了，底下两个，这个估计插画是吧？这个纯粹是插画。有这么多的话，那这个东西估计很长，这长不长？
Talk to me about laying out the house, because you mentioned earlier that there was almost kind of a challenge fitting all of these onto the screen at once in a way that made sense for running around it, right?
Yeah, it's a pretty dense screen. You know, John didn't want to have a lot of unnecessary space or unnecessary things in general. You know, the house could have been quite large and sprawling, but I think navigating around a big house wasn't really meaningful. So here you can just see all the worlds you're going to go into, which is nice because you can directly compare them all, and it's also a status readout of your progress represented by the puzzle pieces you've collected in the frames. We tried a few different things to make all this fit in one screen, including ramps and different configurations, different positions for the ladder, and you know, maybe the ladder isn't the most logical thing to find in a house, but yeah, it all fits.
行，所以 playthrough 基本没有什么新的东西，它完全是让你完整打一遍，然后边打边看。但如果你这样搞的话，也没法把所有的 commentary 看完，所以它确实没有考虑到部分少数玩家的这个心理。它没有任何的新拼图，新拼图只有在 Sound Music 跟 Visual 才会有。Visual 现在这么看下来，我估计好几个已经看过了，对吧？有一部分应该是看过了啊。然后这个是 Galleries， 然后首先想刷成就，但又不喜欢玩 Speedrun 的玩家，他没有考虑到。啊，这 Commentary 你想把所有 Commentary 都看完的玩家，他也没有考虑到，所以他这个设计还是有纰漏。これはさすがに多すぎだろ，这是疯了吧！我操，还跟过来了是吧？他不还会跟过来吗？我操！啊，还能跟过来？shit， 过不来了啊！这是最里面。你要一个 word 看过去的话，我估计应该是能把这里相当多的东西都已经 cover 掉了。等到时候到这儿就快了，所以其实是一样的。能上去吗？这有什么意义吗？ 这个就只能靠 rewind 下来了，是吧？就这样吧。这个 playthrough 超难，争取一期一个 word， 中间夹杂一点，然后把最后那个 word 相对挤在里面，只要2、3、4、5、4期能搞定，剩下就起到这个重复度的问题。先这样。